this video, we're going to be talking about smooth muscles. So, smooth muscles are going to work differently than skeletal muscles. Remember, skeletal muscles, those are voluntary, they're attached typically to bone, and we use them to move around. Smooth muscles, on the other hand, are typically going to be found in hollow organs. They're going to be non-striated, hence smooth. And instead of using them to move around, we're going to be using them to either move things around inside of our body or to control the size of openings inside of our body. So we're going to find smooth muscle in the walls of most hollow organs, with a notable exception being the heart. Again, the heart is going to have cardiac muscle, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the heart itself. We will find smooth muscle in the respiratory tract, digestive tract, urinary system, reproductive system, and all throughout the circulatory system, where it's going to be in charge of controlling the diameter of our blood vessels. When we look at most organs that contain smooth muscle, they're going to have two sheets of smooth muscle, what's called a longitudinal layer that's going to be parallel with the long axis of the organ, and a circular layer, which is going to go around the circumference of the organ. So longitudinal and circular. The longitudinal layer, when it contracts, is going to shorten the organ, and then the circular layer, when it contracts, is going to close up the lumen. For example, in the intestines, a combination of these two layers is going to allow you to mix up the food and also force the food through the intestines and pass it through the digestive tract. When we look at the differences between smooth muscle and skeletal muscle fibers, smooth muscles are these relatively short spindle-shaped fibers, whereas muscle fibers are going to be long and cylindrical. Smooth muscle is also going to be uninucleate and not have any striations. Instead of the 3 layers of connective tissue sheaths that we see in skeletal muscles, smooth muscles are only going to have the endomysium around individual cells. The connection between the nervous system and smooth muscles is going to be different. One, not all smooth muscles actually have nervous innervation. If they are innervated, it's going to be by the autonomic nervous system, not by the somatic motor nerves. And instead of forming the neuromuscular junction, instead we're going to have these varicosities, these swellings of the nerve fibers where a diffuse amount of neurotransmitter is released across a large area, as opposed to released specifically across a synaptic cleft. Another difference is that smooth muscles are typically going to be connected together through what are called gap junctions, and these gap junctions are going to allow electrical impulses to spread from cell to cell to help smooth muscles contract in a organized manner. When we look at a smooth muscle, it doesn't have those striations and those sarcomeres, but it still does have the thick and thin filaments, the actin and myosin filaments, in order to have contractions. Another difference is going to be the source of calcium for smooth muscle contraction. Calcium is going to be the signal for smooth muscles to contract, just like calcium is the signal for skeletal muscles to contract. But the source of that calcium isn't going to be the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Smooth muscles do not have as well a developed sarcoplasmic reticulum as skeletal muscles do. It doesn't store as much calcium. Instead, most of the calcium for smooth muscle contraction is actually going to be extracellular. In order to allow large amounts of calcium to enter into the cell quickly, they have these pocket-like protrusions on their cell membrane, these infoldings called caveola, that are going to have calcium channels on them. That's going to allow calcium to enter into the cell, again, through these voltage-gated calcium channels, rather than releasing most of the calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The thick and thin filaments of smooth muscle, instead of being arranged in the myofibrils, are instead arranged diagonally. And this causes the smooth muscle to contract in a corkscrew-like way, instead of just shortening like a skeletal muscle does. In addition, we're going to have these lattice-like arrangement of these intermediate filaments to help resist tension that are anchored to what are called dense bodies. And that is going to help organize and protect those filaments. Another big difference is that there's not troponin. There's still tropomyosin, which is going to block the actin, preventing the myosin heads from binding to the myosin binding sites on the actin, but there's not troponin. Instead, calcium is going to bond to the protein calmodulin, which is going to lead to the moving of tropomyosin. Smooth muscle is going to have these slow, synchronized contractions as opposed to the very rapid contractions that we see in skeletal muscles. And because they have these gap junctions, action potentials are able to pass from fiber to fiber. In addition, some of the cells are going to be what are called self-excitatory. They're able to depolarize even without being stimulated externally, kind of like pacemakers in the heart, except these are going to be pacemakers in other organs. For example, the intestines actually have their own contractile pace that can be regulated by the nervous system, but it has its own rate of contraction. The contraction of smooth muscle is very energy efficient compared to skeletal muscle. It is slower, but it's able to work for long periods of time with relatively little energy cost and without the same sort of fatigue that we see in skeletal muscle. So smooth muscle is able to constantly maintain an amount of contraction without fatiguing, and we call that smooth muscle tone. Because it's relatively energy efficient, it's able to produce energy through that relatively slow but efficient aerobic respiration pathway. When we see a smooth muscle contract, again, we are going to have an electrical signal pass over the plasma membrane of the smooth muscle. That's going to trigger the opening of voltage-gated calcium channels. And most of the calcium is again going to come from the extracellular environment. That calcium is going to bind to calmodulin. That calmodulin is then going to activate the myosin kinases. And then those myosin kinases are what are going to actually phosphorylate the myosin head, which is going to allow it to activate and cross-bridge with the actin. And again, the myosin-actin cross-bridging is what actually causes the filaments to slide and produces contraction. The regulation of contraction in smooth muscles is a bit different. In skeletal muscles, because they are voluntary, that contraction is going to be controlled by the somatic nervous system. Here, we can have neural regulation from the autonomic nervous system, but these neurotransmitters can actually have stimulatory or inhibitory effects, and the same neurotransmitter can actually be stimulatory or inhibitory depending on the organ and how we want those organs to react. For example, we want some organs to become more active when we're in a stress response and other organs to become less active when we're in a stress response. So we release the same neurotransmitter when we are stressed out, but we want two different organs to respond differently. They can also respond to hormones and local chemicals. So some smooth muscles don't have any connection to the nervous system. So they may spontaneously depolarize, just have those pacemakers like we talked about. But they can also respond to things like hormones or chemical signals that indicate the relative state of your body, like CO2 levels or pH or oxygen levels. So smooth muscles can respond to neurotransmitters, or they can respond to local stimuli. They can also respond to stretch. However, they tend to adapt to the amount of stretch relatively quickly. So they'll respond to stretch and then adapt to the new length, which allows it to adapt when the hollow organ that it encloses changes size. For example, the stomach or the bladder, sometimes they are full, sometimes they are empty. We want the muscle cells to respond in similar ways, even if it's full or empty. We divide smooth muscle into either what we call unitary smooth muscle. This is also called visceral smooth muscle. This is the smooth muscle that we find enclosing hollow organs. And this is going to possess all of the normal characteristics that we've talked about for smooth muscle. They're going to be arranged into those two sheets, the longitudinal and the circular. They're going to be innervated by varicosities by the autonomic nervous system. They're going to have those spontaneous action potentials that act as pacemakers to give it a natural rate of contraction. We're going to have gap junctions connecting them together, and they're going to have the ability to respond to chemical stimuli. Multi-unit smooth muscle works a bit more like skeletal muscle, except it's still going to be non-voluntary. We're going to see this in large airways in the lungs, large arteries, the rector pili muscles. We saw those muscles in the skin to cause the hair to stand up, and also in the iris of the eye in order to control the size of the pupil. In multi-unit smooth muscle, we don't have as much electrical connections between cells, and we don't tend to have the spontaneous depolarization that gives it its own inherent contractile rate. Instead, it's going to be innervated by the autonomic nervous system and arranged into motor units. And because it's arranged into motor units, that allows us to have graded contractions, just like skeletal muscles. Again, that's the ability to determine the amount of strength in the contraction by determining how many motor units are recruited. But again, it's not skeletal muscle, it's smooth muscle. It's going to be controlled by the autonomic nervous system. It's not going to be striated. It's going to be uninucleate. It's going to be spindle-shaped. However, it's going to possess some of the traits that we see in skeletal muscle, unlike unitary smooth muscle. So when we look, here's unitary smooth muscle. You can see we have these autonomic neurons that innervate relatively few of these. Instead, the signal is going to be passed through gap junctions across all of these cells. Whereas in this multi-unit smooth muscle that we see, for example, here, this is controlling the shape of the lens in the eye. We have more controlled innervation of specific cells that are going to be electrically isolated from each other so that we can control exactly how much tension we're going to produce in that muscle.